All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our academic training presentation. My name is Zaina Karabatic, and I'm an Associate Director within the Office of International Student and Scholar Affairs. I'm joined this evening by my colleague, who's going to go ahead and introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Elaine Tan, and I'm the Senior Student Immigration Advisor.
Wonderful. So we are going to start this evening with some of our main takeaways for the evening, meaning that if you take anything away from this presentation, let it be these 4 items. And of course, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Elaine will be monitoring that throughout the presentation. And if there are any pending questions at the end of tonight's session, we will be sticking around to answer them. So not to worry if they don't get answered during the session. So the main takeaways for this evening. The first one, first and foremost, all J-1 employment activities require work authorization. These activities could include things like traditional employment. This is something like a 9 to 5 sort of position. This could be something like an internship, a micro internship. Maybe it's just, a month-long situation. This could be ND sponsored or a Notre Dame promoted experience, self-employment, conferences, publishing for which you're receiving an honorarium. All of these sorts of activities would be categorized under J-1 employment. And would require some sort of work authorization. I do also want to mention that for our J-1 students, on-campus employment also requires authorization, so be sure to get the appropriate authorization before beginning any sort of on-campus or off-campus activities. This brings us to our second point, which is super important, which is to reach out to ISSA before starting any sort of off-campus employment, just to ensure that you have everything you need, meaning the appropriate authorization, in order to begin your employment experience. I also put a sub-bullet point here regarding the ISSA webpage, because I do want to mention that all of the information that we're going to cover this evening is also available on our academic training webpage. This recording of tonight's session will also be posted to that webpage for your future reference. The third bullet point is that employment, any sort of employment you're pursuing off campus using academic training, must be related to the major that is listed on your DS 2019. Lastly, you must apply for academic training before the program end date listed on that DS 2019. Once that program end date arrives, you are no longer eligible to apply for this academic training benefit. I also do want to point out that this particular session is going to be relevant to our J-1 student population. And so if you're a J-1 scholar, this information is not going to be relevant to you. Additionally, we are talking about academic training specifically for those J-1 students whose DS 2019 is sponsored by the University of Notre Dame. If your DS 2019 is not sponsored by Notre Dame, for example, if you're sponsored by Fulbright or some other sponsor, they will be the entity that you'll need to talk to about your academic training benefit. So a quick overview of academic training. What do we mean when we say academic training, which we will abbreviate as AT throughout the presentation? So this is a kind of work authorization that is available for eligible J-1 students. It allows for either part-time or full-time work, training, or any sort of other off-campus experience that's related to your major field of study as listed on your DS 2019. It can be authorized for work that is done either before or after your program completion. So it can be done during your Notre Dame program, or it could be done after your Notre Dame program. So a big question that we get asked is, how do I know that I'm authorized for academic training? So you'll know that you're authorized when you have a DS 2019 with academic training listed on page 1 of the DS 2019. And a letter of confirmation that you're going to receive from ISSA when we approve that academic training request. So if you're wondering how you request that academic training from ISSA, not to worry, we are going to touch on that towards the end of the presentation. We're going to go step by step. So first, let's look a little bit into your eligibility for academic training. What does it mean for you as a J-1 student to be eligible to apply for AT? You're eligible to apply if you meet these following criteria. First of all, that you're maintaining your J-1 status. Presumably, everyone here is maintaining their J-1 status. ISSA will be in communication with you if there is a reason that you are no longer maintaining your J-1 status. You need to be in good academic standing, making normal progress towards your degree completion, and you need to have successfully completed at least one semester at Notre Dame before applying. So if you have not yet completed one semester, then you are not yet eligible to apply for academic training. You need to be sure that you apply for academic training before the program end date on the DS 2019, as we mentioned before. You will not be able to apply if that program end date has already passed. You will have to provide evidence of funding and health insurance for the duration of the academic training. This particular bullet point is going to be particularly relevant for those of you who are applying for academic training for post-completion or after you complete your Notre Dame program. And the reason is because during your Notre Dame program, you're presumably funded or you've already shown proof of funding and you have some sort of health insurance that meets those J-1 requirements. You had to show that when you initially arrived to campus. So if you are applying for academic training after that program end date, then you're going to have to show updated evidence of funding for the duration of the academic training and health insurance that meets those J-1 criteria once your student health insurance is no longer valid after you complete that Notre Dame program. You must have an eligible offer of employment. So in order to apply for academic training, you do have to have a job offer in hand. Your primary purpose in the US as a J-1 student is study and not to work. So I do want to emphasize the academic nature of academic training. Your primary purpose is to study. So the employment that you have on academic training, as we've mentioned, has to be directly related to your major field of study. You should be able to draw a clear line between what you've learned in your program at Notre Dame and the work that you're doing. You have to be able to explain how you're utilizing your studies to do that work. It is practical training from your academic program. As we mentioned, you have to have a written offer of employment. I mentioned we're going to go step by step through what the academic training application process looks like, but part of that will require you to upload your offer of employment. So you do have to have written documentation of that offer of employment. It has to start within 30 days of the program end date. With very few exceptions. What we mean by this is that you have to apply for the academic training before the program end date, but you have to begin working within 30 days of that program end date as listed on your DS 2019. Just a note that monetary compensation doesn't necessarily impact whether or not you need authorization. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different ways that you might be getting compensation, which would require you to have work authorization. But it is important to note that monetary compensation, like a paycheck, for example, isn't the only reason that you would need to have work authorization. So when we talk about employment, what do we mean? What is employment? So the US government defines employment as the rendering of services for any form of compensation, which means that financial compensation, as I mentioned, things like a salary, an honorarium, or a stipend, this isn't the only thing that would require you to have authorization or would mean that you're employed. If your employer is providing things like meals, housing, transportation, lodging, any gift cards, shares, or stocks in their company, any of these things would be considered compensation. And so if you're receiving any of these things, then we would say that you would need to have employment authorization, such as academic training. So academic training employment is employer specific, meaning that you are authorized for a particular employer. When we authorize you for academic training, you're applying to work at a particular place. It is also time specific. You are requesting to work for a particular period of time. It's job specific, meaning you're applying to work for a particular job within that time period with that employer. And lastly, it is location specific. So it is you are applying to work at a particular site of activity, a particular site of employment. So because academic training is all of those things, employer, time, job, and location specific, what this means is that if you were already authorized for academic training and any of those things were changing, if you were changing employers, if you got a new position within your company, if your site of activity changes, if the number of hours per week were to change, any of these things would require a new academic training authorization because the previous one that you received was for a particular employer, a particular time, a particular job at a particular place. So it is important to keep that in mind that you may need to apply for academic training authorization with ISSA more than once if you're planning to pursue employment with different employers or within different positions within the same company even. And then just to note that your academic advisor is going to have to sign off on each of these academic training requests. And we're going to touch on this a little bit more when we go step by step through this process. But actually, they will even need to be signing off on those requests post-graduation when you're no longer a matriculated student at Notre Dame. Again, we're going to touch on this a little bit later. The employment must end when the authorization period ends. So, of course, if you don't have the authorization, of course, you should not be working. So, if you're coming to the end of your academic training, you should be coming to the end of your employment. You should not be working beyond that authorization period unless you have, in a timely manner, applied for a new period of academic training authorization. It must be authorized before the program end date. I know we've reiterated this a few times, but it is really important to understand. As I mentioned, if you don't apply for academic training or submit a new academic training request, if you're going to be pursuing more employment, then you will not be able to access it if the end date on your DS 2019 has already passed. It must start within 30 days of that program end date. So as we said, we have to authorize it before the program end date, and you are required to begin working within the 30 days following that program end date on your DS 2019. You could take a look at your DS 2019 if you're not sure what that program end date is right now. It would be a good thing to keep kind of in the back of your mind. That program end date, for those of you who are still in your Notre Dame program, which I assume is most of you, that currently would be your expected graduation or your expected completion date from your Notre Dame program. However, if you apply for academic training after you graduate, that program end date is going to be inclusive of that academic training period. And so that program end date is going to shift to include that authorization period. And therefore, if you were going to apply for more academic training, then you would need to submit that application, that request for academic training to ISSA before that new program end date. We have a visual towards the end of the slideshow that will kind of help you kind of understand what I mean by that. So what are the types of employment that you can pursue under J-1 academic training? So we call this regular employment, meaning that you're completing an I-9. This is something like, as I mentioned, a 9 to 5, kind of like a typical employment situation. However, you could also be pursuing things like internships or even micro internships, things that are just for a very short period of time. Again, any sort of off-campus employment is going to require authorization, no matter how long the duration of the employment period is. If you're publishing a book and you're receiving compensation or an honorarium, that would be something you could do, or you could use academic training in order to pursue. If you're presenting at a conference and you're receiving some sort of honorarium for that work, that would be something you could pursue on academic training. Rather, it's something that you would need academic training in order to pursue. So we often get a few questions regarding the what kinds of employment are permissible on academic training. So the first one, can I be self-employed while on academic training? So, the Department of State has provided guidance that self-employment is not allowed while on academic training. And the reason for this is because there is this expectation of a supervisory relationship for the student. So, again, there is this idea that you are doing this practical training in your field of study. You are training and are therefore being trained in your field. And so there is this aspect of having a supervisor who is evaluating and assessing the work that you're doing. The next question, can I work remotely while on academic training? So particularly since the pandemic, this is a question we get very often. For our J-1 students, the US government guidance indicates that students who are pursuing academic training should not be working more than 40% of the time remotely. So 40%, you can also think of that as 2 days out of the 5-day work week. If your employer has remote policies, and they've approved this sort of hybrid participation, then you could potentially work 2 out of 5 days remotely, but it should not be more than 40% of your employment time. So, some special considerations regarding the length of the academic training. So, first of all, the duration of your academic training, the amount of time that you're eligible for, it can't exceed the program length of your Notre Dame program. So, for example, if you're in a 12-month program, you wouldn't be eligible for more than 12 months of academic training. For many of our students, particularly our graduate students, you are going to be eligible for a maximum of 18 months, which is total between any academic training you pursue, either before your completion of your Notre Dame program or after. We would also call that pre-completion versus post-completion. And if you are a PhD student or you're a student in a STEM designated program, you would also be eligible for an additional 18 months on top of that initial 18 months. So in total, up to 36 months of academic training. Again, that is only for our PhD students and those students who are in a STEM designated major. And then just a quick note that second 18 months can only be used post-completion. So you could potentially use 18 months of academic training during your Notre Dame program, but that second 18 months, if you're eligible for it, could only be used after you've completed that Notre Dame program. There is no difference while on academic training between part-time or full-time. All of it is being deducted from the 18 months the same way. So if you're working 20 hours a week or you're working 40 hours a week, all of that is chipping away from that 18 months of academic training. We do want to note specifically for full-time work for those students who are pursuing academic training during their Notre Dame program, that full-time employment would only be available for you during designated university breaks, which means like winter break, summer break, spring break, designated university breaks. That's when you'd be able to work full-time. During the academic year, when you're required to be enrolled full-time in classes, so not during a university break, you would only be eligible for part-time academic training. And then, of course, when you move on to post-completion academic training or AT that you're pursuing after you complete the Notre Dame program, then you could work full-time when you're not enrolled full-time in classes. Again, that primary purpose as a J-1 student in the US is to study and not to be an employee. There can be no gaps in your employment while on academic training. And what this means is that if you're changing from one job to the next, your new period of academic training would have to begin immediately after the previous one. So if you're stopping employment with one job on June 1st, then your next period of academic training for your new employer would have to begin on June 2nd. There can be no gaps in your employment on academic training. Academic training is not intended to merely facilitate employment. Again, we really want to emphasize this academic nature. It has to come from this element of applying the work that you are learning about in your program to your employment. And so the primary reason to pursue the primary reason to pursue academic training cannot just be merely because you want to work. There has to be an academic element to it. And again, all of the work that you'd be doing has to be directly related to your major field of study, just as a reminder. You can have multiple employers on academic training, but as we've mentioned, this means that each employer would require a separate application and separate authorization. Again, this goes back to this idea that academic training is employer and job specific. So if you're pursuing multiple jobs, that's okay. You just need to make sure that you have gotten appropriate authorization for each of those positions. And then lastly, the J-1 212E waiver. So some of you may be subject to the 212E home residency requirement. If you're not sure if you're subject, you can check potentially the first page of your DS 2019 or on your visa stamp, your J-1 visa stamp. There may be a notation at the bottom about whether or not you're subject to this 212E home residency requirement. If you are subject, there is an option to apply for a waiver to the home residency requirement. So the home residency requirement means that you would need to spend 2 years in your home country before you'd be able to change status to certain other immigration categories. Again, you can check that visa stamp to see if you're subject. The reason this is really important with regards to academic training is because when you apply for a new period of academic training, as I mentioned, those program dates on your DS 2019, for most of you who are currently in your Notre Dame program, the current program end date will be your expected completion date for the Notre Dame program. However, when you apply for academic training after you graduate, that program end date is going to be inclusive of that new period of academic training. So academic training isn't added on separately, it's part of the entire program duration. And we, as the responsible officers at Notre Dame, we cannot extend that program date for you if you've requested a 212E waiver. And so really what we want to get at is that if you are subject to the 212E home residency requirement, and you're planning to apply for the waiver, that we would advise that you wait to apply until you've maxed out your academic training or until you're nearing your final year and you know that you're not going to plan to extend your J-1 program any further. Again, just to summarize that, we at Notre Dame, we cannot extend the program dates on your DS 2019 if you've applied for that 212E waiver. So pre versus post-completion academic training. Again, when I say pre-completion, I mean that this is academic training that you're pursuing during your Notre Dame program. You have not yet completed the program versus post-completion, meaning academic training that you're pursuing after that program completion. So for pre-completion and post-completion, the employer, as we've mentioned before, the employment is employer specific, job specific, location, and also time specific. This is for both employment pursued on pre-completion AT and post-completion AT. You're required to report your US address information within 10 days of changing it. The US government wants to know where you're located, and so within 10 days of moving, you would need to report that. If you're still within your Notre Dame program, that is typically going to be taken care of during the roll call period. That will be an option for you to report that update to your address. But when you are no longer a student at Notre Dame, you are still going to be required to report updates to that US address information to ISSA so that we can make sure that your immigration record is accurate and up to date. On both pre-completion and post-completion, as we've mentioned, all the work that you're doing has to be directly related to your major field of study. And for any period of academic training that you pursue, either before you graduate or after, at the conclusion of that academic training period, you're going to be required to submit an academic training evaluation. And we will mention where you can find that evaluation information towards the end of the presentation. On post-completion academic training, there are a few things to be aware of that are not necessarily relevant for you during pre-completion academic training. Things like that are applying for the extension prior to the program end date. Again, the program end date currently is probably your expected completion date. So when you're thinking into the future about applying for post-completion academic training for work after you graduate, you're going to want to make sure that you submit that request to ISSA in advance of that DS 2019 program end date. And then anytime in the future that you're extending your DS 2019 program dates for further academic training, you're still going to want to make sure that that academic training request is submitted before the program end date so that we can take action to extend it before that program end date is reached. You're going to need to show appropriate funding for the duration of academic training. Now, I mentioned this a little bit previously, but to confirm, right now you've already shown funding for the duration of your J-1 program. However, once you complete that program, we at ISSA, before we can extend that DS 2019 further, we're going to need proof of funding once again for the duration of the academic training that you're going to pursue. Many students will submit proof of their salary for their job that they're going to be pursuing. They'll present that to cover their expenses for academic training. You'll also be required to maintain appropriate health insurance. This is one of the requirements of maintaining your J-1 status. Right now, many of you are probably enrolled in Notre Dame's student health insurance, which is great. However, that student health insurance is going to expire once you conclude your Notre Dame program. And so again, before ISSA can extend that DS 2019 further, we're going to need further proof that you have health insurance to cover you during the period of academic training that you're applying for. Make sure to be monitoring communications from ISSA. ISSA, or rather Notre Dame, is still the program sponsor of your J-1 status. And so you still have full access to ISSA and our advising resources. And we will be sending you communication, important reminders about your status or immigration updates. And so it's really important to be monitoring that communication from our office because we will be sending you very important information. And then finally, making sure to report to ISSA if you change your status or if you've decided to depart the United States. Any of these updates to your J-1 status would also need to be reported to ISSA so that, again, we can keep your J-1 record up to date. So now moving on to the timeline and process of applying for academic training. So this is that visual that I was referencing to kind of give you an idea of kind of when you might apply for academic training, or rather when you would be eligible to apply. So in this top line regarding pre-completion academic training, again, this would be academic training for employment you're doing before you complete your Notre Dame program. So we mentioned that you have to complete at least one semester in J-1 status before you become eligible to apply for AT. So during this period between your Notre Dame program start date and the end of the first semester, you wouldn't be eligible. However, once you reach that first semester marker, then you'd be eligible to apply for pre-completion academic training through whatever your program end date is. As an example, we've just listed the graduation date for spring 2024, which is May 19th, 2024. If you're applying for work that you're planning to do after that program end date, that would then be considered post-completion. So here we've kind of tried to outline some of the important things to consider for post-completion AT for that timeline. So here you have your Notre Dame program end date. Again, we've just used the spring 2024 graduation date as an example. So that's May 19th, 2024. That employment start date we mentioned has to be within 30 days of that program end date on your DS 2019. So you would have to begin working within that time period. And then you could potentially be authorized for academic training for up to 18 months or potentially up to 36 months if you're a PhD student or a student in a STEM designated field. So just to kind of give you a visual of what this might look like for you. So now we'll go step by step about what exactly it looks like now that you've learned all this information about what academic training is, how you become eligible for academic training, the kind of employment that you can pursue. How do you actually go about submitting this academic training request and getting the authorization? So the first step, congratulations, you've already done it. You have viewed the academic training information session, so we can check that box. Step 2 is obtaining that written offer of employment from the company that you plan to be working for. And we do list out some of the information that that letter will need to contain. If that offer letter that you have doesn't contain all of this information, you may need to follow up with your employer to request a specific letter that mentions all of this. This is all things, all this information are things that we need to know in order to recommend you, to authorize you for academic training on your immigration record. So the kind of work that you're doing, your position title, as we mentioned, academic training is position specific, a description of the work that you're going to be doing, your responsibilities, the objectives of the work, your employment start and end date. We have to know the exact dates that we're going to be authorizing you for. Again, because you have to have an offer of employment to request academic training, we can't just recommend you for that whole 18 months unless you have employment for that entire 18 months. If you are graduating on May 19th, 2024, and your employment is only for the summer, and so let's say your end date of your employment is August 1st, we would only be authorizing you for academic training from whenever you were starting within the 30-day period, or I'm sorry, from May 20th after you completed your program on May 19th until that August 1st date. And then you would have to resubmit this request, get a new offer for a new position in order to be authorized for academic training beyond that date. So we don't just authorize you in bulk for that entire period that you might be eligible for. And then the number of hours that you're going to be working per week. As we mentioned, there is no part-time, full-time. It all is deducting at the same rate from those 18 months of academic training. So the next step, if you're applying for post-completion academic training, as we mentioned, you're going to have to provide a little bit more documentation to ISSA in order for us to authorize you for academic training. This documentation includes salary information or proof of funding to cover the expenses during that period. As I mentioned, most of those people applying are going to be submitting their proof of salary for the job that they're going to be doing as proof of funding to cover the expenses. And then, as I mentioned, that proof of health insurance that meets the J-1 requirements, we have this information also listed on our website. So you can find that there if you're not sure if the health insurance options that you're looking at meet those criteria. And then the next step is to actually complete the request form in ISSA Link. So again, as I mentioned, even if you're going to be graduating and you're going to be applying for post-completion academic training, you still have full access to the ISSA office and our resources. You'll still be able to access ISSA Link. And so you'll be submitting the academic training request through issalink.nd.edu. We do ask that you submit this request at least 2 weeks in advance of when you plan to start working. And of course, as I've mentioned several times at this point, before the program end date listed on your DS 2019. The reason we ask for these 2 weeks is, first of all, because we need time to process that request. But second of all, it gives us a little bit of a grace period if there's any sort of follow-up that we need with you or potentially your academic advisor to get further information. So this is what that information, the screen will look like in ISSALink. So if you were to log into issalink.nd.edu, on the left-hand side, you'll see a J-1 Student Services button, and you'll click that. And within that, you'll see all of these e-forms, and you'll see the academic training request is one of them. And that is the form you would click on, which would prompt you to input your employer information, upload the relevant documentation, and then you would submit it. I should have waited until I went to the next slide. So you input all of that employment information, you input your academic or your faculty advisor's name or information. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation, every academic training request that you submit will also require some sort of academic approval by your academic or faculty advisor. They'll have to sign off on the information that you're providing for this request. So you'll be asked to put their name and contact their email address in the e-form before you submit it. In terms of the documentation that you're going to upload, this will be your I-94 record. If you don't know what the I-94 record is, or you haven't looked at your I-94 record since the last time you entered the US, now would be a great time to go ahead and do that, pull it up, save it for your records. You will certainly need to upload your most recent I-94 record when you apply for academic training. Again, that proof of funding, that proof of health insurance documentation. Once you upload that, then you'll submit the e-form. form. However, when you submit it, it doesn't come to ISSA right away for us to process it. Since we still need that academic approval from your academic or faculty advisor, when you submit it, an email is automatically generated to that person whose email address you provided, and then they will have a link that they can go into and submit their approval. It does not, the e-form request does not come to ISSA as a complete application until we have both your portion of the form and your advisor's portion. Only when we have both of those pieces of information can we then move forward with authorizing you for academic training and issuing that new DS 2019. If you've already graduated and you're going to be submitting a new academic training request, it may be a good idea to reach out to your previous advisor, particularly if you haven't been in communication with them for a little while, just to let them know that this is coming through. Because again, even after you've graduated, we will still need that academic confirmation. So the next step is the ISSA. This is when we do our portion of the processing. So we authorize, with all the information you've provided, we take that information and we authorize you for academic training on your J-1 CVIS record. Once we authorize you for that employment period, we will issue you a new DS 2019 and an employment confirmation letter. So at the beginning of the presentation, one of the questions that I mentioned was, how do I know that I'm authorized? So at this point, when you receive that new DS 2019 with the academic training information and that confirmation letter, this is how you'll know that you're authorized for that period of academic training. Just to note that we are now sending DS 2019s as we're sending them electronically. So they will be PDF attachments to the email, to the approval email for the form that you submit. So you're going to get an email letting you know that the request was approved and that DS 2019 will be attached. And it will have digital signatures from the responsible officers, which is the ISSA team. And then you will need to print it out and hand sign it. I should also note that if you have any J2 dependents, that their DS 2019s will also be updated and issued along with that. They will also be attached as a PDF and be signed. And then just a really important note, kind of around this idea that you should never be working without authorization. Having a letter, a signature, or some sort of verbal approval from any other entity on campus does not constitute employment authorization for immigration purposes. So again, how you know that you're authorized is by having that new DS 2019 in hand and having that confirmation letter from ISSA confirming that you're authorized for the employment that you've requested. So that is the only way that you'll be authorized for academic training. So the final step, this is actually not going to be part of the initial process of requesting academic training, but is kind of a closing of the loop of your academic training experience. At the conclusion of every period of academic training, you're going to be required to submit an academic training evaluation to ISSA. And where this is found, well, so first, what is the evaluation? So ISSA is required to evaluate the effectiveness and the appropriateness of the training in achieving the goals and objectives that you laid out when you initially requested that academic training. So that'll be, those goals and objectives will be something that you and your advisor confirm in the initial academic training request. And this evaluation, again, is just confirming the effectiveness and appropriateness of that academic training period in reaching those goals and objectives. When do you have to submit an evaluation? So again, upon completion of that academic training authorization period with a particular employer. So if you are eligible for 36 months of academic training and you've worked with one employer, you have stayed with that employer for the entirety of your academic training, then you are only submitting one evaluation. However, if you are changing positions or employers throughout your academic training experience, then you may be submitting multiple evaluations depending on how many periods of academic training you have. Where do you submit this evaluation? So it is also an e-form in ISSA-Link, and it is called the Academic Training Evaluation e-form. Again, to confirm, even as an alumni, you still have full access to ISSA, ISSA-Link, ISSA Advising Services, all of that information, you still have access to it. So you'll still be able to access the ISSA-Link e-forms. So the training evaluation, the academic training evaluation is an e-form in ISSA-Link. That's where you'll find it when you need it. So how do you access ISSA after graduation? So again, you'll still have access to it. You're just going to access it a little bit differently. So this may look familiar for those of you who have submitted a request in ISSA previously. However, as an alumni, meaning that this would be relevant to you when you're requesting post-completion academic training. If you're requesting pre-completion, you're going to be able to access ISSA the same way that you always have. If you've graduated and you're now an alumni, you will no longer have access to your Okta because you're going to lose access to that Notre Dame email address. And so because of that, we've had to create a workaround in order to allow you to access our system and submit those e-forms. And so instead of logging in through this nice, pretty login button here, we have a little box at the bottom. It's a link for Notre Dame alumni, and you will log in here. Essentially, it's going to have you input your Notre Dame ID number, some personal details like your birth date, and then you will get a PIN, and you'll be able to log in with a PIN instead of through Okta. Again, that's really only relevant for those who are going to be requesting academic training post-completion. So again, just to reiterate these four main takeaways from tonight's presentation, all J-1 employment activities require work authorization. To confirm, this means on campus and off campus, even though tonight's presentation was about off-campus work authorization. These activities might be things like short-term internships. They might be things like longer-term 9-to-5 positions. It might be something like a one-day event you presented at a conference, you published a book and you're receiving compensation. All of these different things would require work authorization. Be sure to reach out to ISSA before starting any sort of off-campus employment. If you're not sure if you need authorization, we are happy to review some sort of offer that you've received and give you our best advice about what your next steps are. But the important thing is not to begin working and then later come back and realize that actually you needed authorization and you didn't have it. The employment that you're pursuing on academic training has to be related to the major that's listed on your DS 2019. You are required to be working within your major field of study. And then finally, you have to apply for academic training before your DS 2019 program end date. Very, very important. Finally, we want to conclude with our advising resources. We are going to stick around if you have any further questions, but if questions come up maybe a few months from now, this is how you'll be able to access our office and our team. You can definitely send us an email. You can come to our walk-in advising. You can do virtual drop-in advising, or you can schedule a one-on-one appointment, whatever's most convenient. We are there to support you. So that's all that we have in terms of a formal presentation, but we will be taking questions. We'll be sticking around. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And like I said, we'll be sticking around for about another 5 or so minutes to take any questions that didn't get answered.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So I'm a J-1 student, PhD student, so I'm graduating right now. I'm curious about like specifically jobs that I can take that you're saying. So I should get just a postdoc or some like very academical job. So if I get something not so close related job, it will not be approved by academic training.
So I'm sorry. So are you asking if you got a postdoc, if that would be eligible for academic
No,
training?
I understand that it will be completely eligible. Like I'm speaking about industry mostly. What if like I go to industry